Our next speaker is Nellie Ocher from University of Twente, and she's going to be talking about acting with telemonitoring technologies. Nellie, of course, is very well known for her work on feminist technology studies and recently on users, and I'm looking forward to the talk.
I don't know if you noticed it, but there was just a demonstration here of non-use. I will talk about non-use. I'm a non-user, or only one of them. I'm a non-user of the Mac, so I had to have assistance of Lucy. So thank you, Lucy. And thank you, Mike. No? It's very loud in my ear. Yeah? Is this better? Yeah? Okay. Thank you. Another thing we need, depending on others. I want to talk about acting with telemonitoring technologies, and of course, this is the idea about bracketing. We were explicitly invited to talk about innovative technologies, and well, I hope you will learn from my talk as well that maybe I'm not bracketing, but I will try to discuss specific research strategies we can use to open the black box of these type of technologies. So, what is the novelty of the telemonitoring technologies? Or first of all, what are these kind of new devices? There are devices introduced in Europe and the US and Asia. Those are devices that are meant to be used to diagnose, monitor, or even treat patients at a distance by the use of ICTs. So that's where the word tele comes from. So the promise is that they want to provide care at a distance. The claim of novelty is that healthcare can be provided at a distance by replacing face-to-face contacts with technology-mediated interactions. This acting at a distance challenges existing modes of interaction. The corporeal co-presence, here I refer to Goffman's term, of doctors and patients is replaced by a tele-co-presence that's often asymmetrical. So patients are always accessible to doctors and nurses, where it's not the reversed order. These changing modes of interaction introduce new ways of observing, disciplining, and knowing bodies. And that's why I think it's an important topic for STS to research. So, what I want to do in my talk today, and I really like the invitation because it also made me reflect on my own, maybe implicit research strategies here, is that I want to present two research strategies to act with technologies. The first one is telling other stories than a dominant story. When you look at the program, this research strategy is actually very well presented. But it's very visible in one of the titles of one of the papers. It's the paper of Ernst Walstraud. He has the title of his paper as Acting with Science to Tell the Story Differently. Of course, this approach is not new for STS. It has a strong constructivist heritage. It's ever since first the constructivist studies were introduced, the phase has become very famous that it could have been otherwise. That was one of the implicit or sometimes explicit aims of our work, to show that it could have been otherwise. Secondly, there is also very strong feminist heritage here. And here I quote Donna Haraway's work, and that's already from her Cyborg Manifesto of 1985. She talked about feminism is about a search for new stories and for a language which names a vision of possibilities and limits. Since the science wars, STS has become more aware to be very careful to communicate to scientists and other audiences that telling other stories than the dominant discourse should not be understood as a way of debunking science, but rather as a way of showing how new technologies are interwoven with people, institutions and society, others in other ways than designers ever imagined. That was also one of the implicit instructions we got for our papers from Mike. So, what other stories are there to tell about telemonitoring? What other stories do I want to tell about telemonitoring? The first story I want to tell is the story about the invisible work of healthcare professionals and patients. A central feature in the dominant discourse is that costs of healthcare can be reduced from delegating tasks from doctors to other staff members, less expensive nurses, or to machines, or to devices. And consequently, the promise is that healthcare will become less dependent on people, expensive people, and become more cost-effective. Well, I think this dominant discourse has a major problem. The major problem is that it represents a relationship between people and machines in terms of creating invisibilities and making over-promises that cannot be met. And of course, there's a long history here as well in social science research. It was already Ivan Illich in the early 1980s who suggested that work does not disappear with technological age. Rather, it is displaced sometimes onto machines, as often onto workers. So it's more likely that new technologies will lead to a redistribution of work and not to a reduction of work. This theme has also been taken up by SDS scholars, particularly by Lee Starr and Anson Strauss, who have tried to understand the processes of what they call the ecology of visible and invisible work. They argued that what counts as work shapes the invisibility of specific expertise and specific groups of actors. So if we look at dominant discourses on telemonitoring, we can see that patients' actions are not considered as work and thus make invisible what kind of expertise and what kind of work is involved in making these technologies work. I think what I want to add to the studies that have been done until now by SDS researchers is that these kinds of network type of technologies not only lead to a redistribution of work, but also the introduction of a new kind of work that is completely absent in the dominant discourses and the promises on telemonitoring technologies. First, I'll shortly mention a kind of new work of patients, and then I want to turn to the healthcare workers. The first type of work that patients need to do, first of all, of course, is the political move to talk about patients' actions at work. The first type of work, it's a biographical work. That's, here I use the term of Gubian. Patients have to adopt different relations between bodies, technologies, and self. And that's a completely different version than the dominant discourse that suggests that the technology is just a neutral tool that facilitates patients and nurses and doctors to cope with a disease. No, it really intervenes in these processes. And that's, of course, a well-taken argument by other SDS scholars as well. So biographical work is invisible. Also, the domestication work. That's the kind of work that these patients have to do because the technology is used in the home. But I think there is a rich possibility here of also intervening into this theory on domestication, because usually it focuses on consumer technologies and not on medical technologies. So, for example, if we go to patients' places, we've been there, we observed how they use the technology. They have to integrate it into the private sphere of their homes. And that's really a lot of work involved there. Like I said, it's new kinds of work, even also new kinds of workers. So since 15 years now, we have all of a sudden we have telenurses, teledoctors, telephysicians, telecardiologists, And they also do specific kinds of work that's made visible in the dominant discourse. Telenurses, for example, when we did observations in the medical centers where the transformation of data between the patients and the clinic is taking place, we soon learned that these nurses did much more than the things they learn in the instructions and that's made visible also in the leaflets. They actually do quite some work to reassure patients about their abilities to master the new technology. And they try to overcome resistance to the technology. So actually the kind of work they're doing here is what we can call inclusion work. And here I refer to the work of Els Vonnes on ICTs in another context. Television, also a new category of workers. In their instructions, it's very technical, very instrumental, and it doesn't talk at all about a major part of the time what they do when they have to answer a phone call of one of the patients. That's what you could call intimacy work. They have to make a trusting relationship with the patients. They will never see and will never meet in person. So they do a lot of intimacy work, or what you could call creating intimacy at a distance. So this was short as a first strategy, you could say, as acting with technologies. The second one is that I want to talk about a focus on non-users, because the work we've been doing, I think, in the last 10, 15 years, it has been important to look at user-technology relations. But in this process, we've also realized that non-users have become less visible in our stories. Richard Rogers has attributed this absence of non-users to the pro-innovation bias, so that technologies are introduced, that the expectation is that you have first early adopters and then laggards, and in the end everyone will use it. And I think we shouldn't buy into this rhetoric. I should mention several exceptions of STS scholars who've done work on non-users. Sally Wyatt has tried to define different kind of categories for non-users, and I really think that's important work. Jane Summerton did some work on non-users. Ron Klein, historian of science and technology, did quite some work on non-users. And historians in general, with this notion of resistance that was very strong in the 1970s, to look at resistance to technologies. But again, reflecting on this work, I think the emphasis was very much on what non-use is doing to technologies, and not so much about what non-use is doing to users. So I think this is the entrance I take as well for my current research. In this research, I only look at one specific type of use, or non-user, that you can call a rejecter. And I think, oh, we should get back. Well, just don't look at the screen and just listen to me. This comes later. So I think it's important to look at what non-use is doing for users. And in this looking at users, non-use, I conceptualize it as a self-reflective and symbolically significant act. So in this sense, it's a critical departure of conceptualizations that describe non-use in terms of a deficit framework that's very dominant in innovation studies, but also in telemonitoring discourses. So now I come to this screen. What can comparing users with non-users, what does it enable us to do? Because the methodological consequence, I think, of focusing on non-users is not to see it as a flip-flap. So we focus on users, we did this, and now we focus on non-users. Now I think it's very important to compare and contrast use and non-use of a specific system. What this enables us to do is first, and I discussed it already a bit, is to avoid pro-innovation bias. Second, and I think this is increasingly important, that it enables also us to give visibility and also what you could call credibility to non-users. Because you also see this happening with the dominance of other ICTs we use in our daily life, that non-use, people have to defend it all the time because it's something very negative, it's very conservative, it's something be against progress. And I think it's much richer to understand non-use as trying to understand what type of networks non-users rely on to, in this case, deal with their failing bodies. It's not only that it's this system and then you're a non-user, so you are devoid of any technologies. No, it's a rich science also to look how so-called non-users of these systems live their lives. The third thing, I think, what a comparison between users and non-users enables us to do is also to unpack novelty. And here I think I relate also to the introduction. I think it's important to have an antidote to claims that new technologies are the only solution to a specific problem. And that's very dominant rhetoric in the discourse on telemonitoring technologies. One of the claims of novelty is that telemonitoring technologies introduce a new way of self-care. This makes you believe that there were no healthcare services for patients, and I look particularly at heart failure patients, to support self-care prior to the introduction of these technologies. Well, this is not the case. If you compare users with non-users of specific telemonitoring systems for heart failure patients, I soon learned that both groups are enrolled in different networks of care that have different important differences. For users of these telemonitoring systems, they are enrolled in networks in which self-care is an obligation. If they don't send their data, so that daily they have to measure their weight and measure their blood pressure, if they don't send the data to the telemedical center, they get a phone call. What happens? Also, in case when there are so-called deviant measures, because there is a set standard for the weight and blood pressure, they also get a phone call. So it's really turns self-care into an obligation. And the interviews and observations we did on users were that some of them really liked it, but the people we interviewed who rejected this system, they really resisted this, what you can call compelled compliance. They performed a kind of self-care that wanted to prefer to go to the clinic once every 3 months and to visit the heart failure nurse and to do the monitoring themselves. So it's a completely different way of self-care, different relations between bodies, technology and self that emerged in these type of networks. How much do I have for time now? Okay. So, the fourth kind of thing we could do with comparing users with non-users is also to reveal that new technologies are not just a mutual replication that can replace existing provisions. That's at least what the providers of the systems make us believe, but that they introduce other relations between bodies, technologies, and self. And I have here just one example to give you a bit of an idea. For users of these telemonitoring systems, their bodies become objects for technology, experts, and themselves, and they are always accessible to experts. When we interviewed and observed patients, they were not aware that their bodies and their data were now introduced in a widespread network where all different kinds of actors could observe their data. Non-users of these systems, for their bodies, they remain objects for themselves and medical experts. And they were much more aware, and that's why they rejected to use the technology, by the fact that others could get access to their data. So the questions were very much in terms, what happens, is there someone watching me all the time? Is there someone, then phoning me what to do? And they really rejected it. They didn't want to become controlled and surveyed in this way. So I think the kind of argument I want to develop here is very much, even in this term of telemonitoring, it seems to suggest that this is the only way of monitoring bodies. But in our study, it's also it's very visible that there's also this face-to-face monitoring, where there are completely different configurations of identity selves and bodies performed than in the tele-monitoring sessions. And here I think this notions of technologies of self, as introduced by Foucault, is very useful to explore further. To come to conclusions, I just took two kinds of different research strategies to, the system is very sensitive. Yes, it's a definite sign, and one last sheet. I think the only thing I wanted to do is, I have this modest attempt of trying to see how this acting with, how we can do this in different ways with different consequences. And it's not to generalize about how we should do it, but only two ways how we could do it. I only, very shortly, want to mention a third way of acting with these type of technologies that I think is very important and that I want to explore also in the next project. That's more of intervening into the design. I mean, looking at the papers and presentations during the conference, you can see that what you can call CTA approaches, interventionist approaches, even more this action research kind of questions pop up again, and sometimes in completely different ways than we used to use them 10 or 20 years ago. So I think that's also a very rich area to explore. This was my talk. Thank you.
Okay, as we're preparing the technology that you're using to telemonitor us, I'll introduce our next speaker, who has a disarmingly short topic. The subject of her talk is subject objects, and I think that title contains within it the agency that acting with is all about. So, Lucy, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay,
yes.
You're on.
Okay, I wanted to start by acknowledging and thanking participants at the Danish STS conference earlier this summer, where I presented a first version of this talk, and I hope that the repeat is still interesting for you all. Please look at my face, entreats Mertz, the speaking robot, installed in the atrium lobby of the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at MIT. Designed to engage passing humans in communicative exchange, Mertz is the materialization of what its designers describe as a robotic creature that lives around people on a regular basis and incrementally learns from its experience. A worldly robot, in other words, and like all truly worldly things, Mertz now stars in a YouTube video, which I will play for you now. And not the greatest cinematic screen, I'm afraid, but. I have to. Interesting bug. My screen size is big enough that I can't get at these. There we go. Except I do need sound, so I'm going to start this over again.
What is your name? Your name is Jerry.
Is what?
Yes, Turbo.
No, your turn.
Say yes, Turbo. Please look at my face. He's speaking in French. Are you saying you're in trouble?
No.
Hello, what is your name?
Gautier.
Your name is Henry. Yes, hello. No, it's Mark. I cannot see you. I'm here. Please look at my face. What did you say? Please take cigarette, please. What? Please take cigarette.
So ridiculous.
Hello, what is your name? And yours? Please
You have to.
Are you seeing me now? Are you seeing me now? Please take cigarette, please. You are too far away. Let's go with my robot. Let's go and talk. Too many words.
I don't understand any language, but I am trying to learn and repeat simple words you say.
Come closer, please.
You cannot communicate.
Come closer, please.
Am I close enough?
Too far away. Come closer, please. I think you have to read these. Okay, goodbye. Bye-bye.
Yes, for Mertz. Recognizable as a childlike creature by humans nurtured in the Disney-saturated worlds of 20th century media, Mertz hails these passers-by into an encounter typical of the perplexing mix of enchantment and mystification that comprises the search for intelligibility in artificial life. Even without a close reading of the exchange, we can note the moment-to-moment shifting choreography of its lively objects and obliging subjects. Goucher and Marta's unremarkably human competencies alternately shape them into appropriately cartoon subjects for reciprocal engagement with Mertz, and reframe the robot as an object of their shared puzzlement and pleasure. Mertz, meanwhile, robotically translates the fragments of sound and motion that these noisy objects emit into readable signals and enacts its own inbuilt logic of more and less sensible replies. Entrained by Mertz's vitality, Goucher and Marta are robotically subjectified. Shifting their orientation to each other's queries and laughter, the robot is correspondingly restored to human-like objectness. As part of an experiment conducted sometime in 2004, Mertz runs more or less continuously for 7 hours a day over 5 days, recording its own visual input and corresponding output every second, and engaging over 600 passers-by. Analyzed as graphs and pie charts of percentages of correct recognition of human faces and robot-directed speech, the data are taken at least tentatively to confirm the experimenters' hopes for the possibility that robots might recruit humans to scaffold their robotic development in a way modeled on and implicitly providing a model for the socially situated learning of the human infant. What senses should we make of model in organisms like this one, produced by the sciences of the artificial and positioned as quasi, almost, or proto-humans? What counts as evidence in contemporary roboticists' claims for the humanness of things? And what are the stakes for implicated subjects and objects? What relations of mechanism and organism are implied in the stories that animate this particular form of technoscientific nature culture? Where is the robot's liveliness, and what are its limits? What are the relations of the lively, the animate, and the organic? And what is the original human of which the robot is an imitation? Like other model organisms, the laboratory robot's life is infused with its inherited materialities and with the ongoing or truncated labors of its affiliated humans. But while animal models are rendered progressively more standardized and replicable as tools for the biological sciences, the humanoid robot is individuated and naturalized. Unlike its cousins on the factory floor or on the shelves of high-tech gadget outlets, the humanoid robot resists economies of scale. As a consequence, the robot remains tied to the personae of its inventors. Nowhere is this celebrity status more evident than in the mediagenic sociable robots of MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence laboratories. The iconic robot infant, parent of Mertz, is Kismet, the offspring of roboticist Cynthia Brazil and colleagues. Like other celebrity robots produced in the Rodney Brooks studios, Kismet is represented through an extensive corpus of media renderings, stories, photographs, and QuickTime videos available on the World Wide Web. And I'll show you again the very beginning of this video of Cynthia Brazil introducing us to Kismet.
I'm interested in learning in a social context where it's the interaction I try to exploit is something like an infant caretaker interaction, where I'm the caretaker essentially and the robot is like an infant. And I want to exploit these kinds of interactions that parents have always been giving their children in terms of constraining the environment, making the environment suitable for learning, helping the infant learn over time. And the motivations play a critical role in that as far as the infant telling the mother, am I being overwhelmed? Am I being bored? How should you be interacting with me to optimize my learning ability? And me, being the caretaker, being very receptive to reading these emotional cues and responding to them in the way I interact with the robot to promote its learning. This is Kismet. Kismet's my infant robot. It gives me facial expressions, which tells me what its motivational state is. This first one is anger, extreme anger. Disgust, excitement, fear. This is happiness. This one is interest. This one is sadness, surprise. This one is tired, and this one is sleep.
Okay, I'm going to leave that there. Yes. These representations allude to the robot's specific materialities, its intensively motorized face affording multiple degrees of freedom in eyebrows, eyes, lips, and ears, its multi-camera vision system, and the elaborate machinery that processes input stimuli and controls responsive output. When asked on another occasion how many person hours it took to develop Kismet, Brazil replies, "Oh God, I don't even want to think about it. There's tons of infrastructure code that isn't specifically for this robot. Code to specifically run Kismet is probably 2 full-time people working for 2.5 years. The total size of all the software tools we've developed to support our computation environment is huge." But this extensive inheritance of material practice is obscured by a narrative of individual motivation, gestated in the laboratories of 20th century developmental psychology. As a three-dimensional caricature of an interactive, empathetic organism, the robot is a rich source of evidence for this wider cultural and historical heritage. A preliminary inventory of the latter would include 2 things. First, a human science based on discourses of homeostasis, regulation, drives, and associated emotional expression. And second, a story of becoming as development and of normative socialization as the grounds for intelligibility. The enumeration of Kismet's emotions displayed as facial expressions of underlying states and made intelligible for us by Brazil's expert reading connects this lab to other laboratories of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as British and European physiologists join with new visualization technologies to isolate, replicate, standardize, and quantify emotion in the language of curves and numeric tables. Historian of medicine Othniel George describes how in the laboratory, the drive to produce clear, compelling representations of emotional states led to the co-configuring of imaging technologies and subjects. Good and reliable subjects are chosen for their ability to display clearly recognizable emotions on demand, while those that fail to produce unambiguous and easily classifiable behaviors are left out of the experimental protocol. By the 1930s, this science is well established, and what is characterized as the objective inscription of emotions reaches a consensus sufficient to support an associated industry of commercially manufactured emotion-gauging machines. It's from this point in turn that emotions are established as processes in the general scheme of the body as machine. While contemporary robotics research carries on this tradition in constructing affective encounters as moments of display and recognition of underlying emotional states, Brazil further joins this history with another turn in 20th century psychology, adopting the language of infant and child development. Purportedly general claims about the child, Claudia Castaneda reminds us, need always to be located in particular discursive contexts. Among other connotations, the figure of the child inherited within colonial imaginaries carries with it a process of becoming made up of inevitable stages and unfulfilled potentialities. In the case of the infant robot, the developmental trope underwrites a kind of perpetual promise that simultaneously accounts for the incompleteness of the project and motivates its continuation. In a recent discussion of Kismet, Evelyn Fox Keller affirms that projects in so-called robotic psychology, epigenetic robotics, or developmental robotics are in turn aimed at informing a science of the human. Keller raises a concern with what she names the apparently circular trajectory of this endeavor, insofar as it materializes discourses in developmental psychology, then represents itself as an independent testbed for assessing their adequacy. Once having entrained a human interactant, the question remains, however, of just how a robot like Kismet incorporates a caregiver's responses in order to become more human-like. Keller argues that it's at this point that roboticists engage in what she names a form of fudging, backpedaling on claims for the achievement of genuine emotion in favor of a functional equivalent at the robot-human interface that will enhance the human's experience. Accepting this latter premise, Keller frames her concern with humanoid robotics projects in terms of the possible realization of their promises. For me, however, the fear is less that robotic visions will be realized, though real money will be diverted from other investments, than that the discourses and imaginaries that inspire them will retrench received conceptions, both of humanness and of desirable robot potentialities, rather than challenge and hold open the space of possibilities. Each demonstration of the humanoid robot enacts what Karen Barad has named a particular agential cut, creating specific objects of attention and concern and inseparable knowing subjects. But what if we could restore non-innocence to robot demonstrations and to the subject-object relations, the particular tropes of acting with innovative technologies that they enact? To do this work requires slowing down the rhetorics of human-like machines and attending closely to material practices. Respecifying the roboticist's labors and her and others' interactions with her machines might contribute to demystifications and re-enchantments restorative to the life of subject and objects alike. This requires, on the one hand, bringing the roboticist into the frame, and on the other, tracing the entanglements to which her work is stickily joined. Marana Alak shows a way toward the first of these through her observations of how roboticists mobilize their own bodies as conduits to enact the movements of a sociable robot, demonstrating in the process the ways in which, in her words, quote, the body as a unified entity disintegrates through practice, and reveals the social body as always already multi-party bodies in interaction. The roboticists of Alak's study are moved by their subject-object and literally feel its body in their own movements as an inseparable prerequisite for their problem-solving and engineering practice. It's in this sense, she argues, that the body of the other, or of the robot as quasi-other, functions not simply as a mirror or replica, but as part of a larger configuration within which agencies are made. With respect to sticky genealogies, we have now no shortage of scholarship tracing the movements through which information theoretic accounts are translated from analogy to ontology in biology, psychology, and sociology in the mid-20th century, and of their ancestry in commercial and military instrumentalism. Insofar as communication acts as an integrating circuit for these translations, it's a crucial site for reconfiguring. Communication, as Emanuel Shegloff reminds us, is not the medium through which an exchange of messages takes place, or the means by which intentionality and interpretation operationalize themselves. Rather, interaction in the ethnomethodological sense is a name for the ongoing contingent co-production of a mutually intelligible socio-material world. In attempting to understand the constitution of the human-machine interface, I've argued that subject-subject interactions involve forms of mutual intelligibility intimately connected with, but also importantly different from, the intelligibilities involved in relations of subject and objects. The term mutuality, with its implications of reciprocity, is crucial here, and I would argue needs to be understood as a particular form of collaborative world-making characteristic of those beings whom we identify as living organisms. But how then might we make sense of the mixture of objectifying and intimately intersubjective engagements between roboticists and their companion robots? Undoubtedly, as Haraway writes of primatologist Barbara Smuts in her encounter with the baboons of the Rift Valley in Tanzania, Cynthia Brazil's practice of becoming with Kismet has, to quote Haraway, rewoven the fibers of the scientist's being. But what kind of becoming with is happening in the laboratories of roboticists informed by behavioral and developmental psychologies engineered over the last century? How do these narratives get woven into or superimposed upon their subject objects, and what happens to both outside the frame in what Haraway calls the extremely prosaic, relentlessly mundane ways through which worlds come into being? In the company of many here, I would like to work against the digital naturalization of conventional visions of life, and for a greater sense of possibility in relations of becoming with for humans and machines. As a final demonstration of what such possibilities might be, I offer the example of Robota, a humanoid robot created in the laboratory of the Adaptive Systems Research Group in Hertfordshire under the tutelage of Dr. Ben Robbins. Himself an experienced therapist, Robbins has worked with colleagues to explore the possibilities for the therapeutic incorporation of robots into engagements with autistic children.